No matter what team you're a fan of in the NBA, no matter how much you love the guys on your team's roster, there is always that one guy, sometimes it's more than one, that you would like to see traded. Whether you don't like aspects of their game, maybe it's the negative attitude they have that brings the team down, or maybe it's a player you do actually like, but know that they aren't going to be a viable long-term option for the team and have a high trade value that could fetch you a decent amount in return. Whatever the case may be, there are players that should and are going to be traded in a given season, and in today's video we're going to be discussing one player from every Eastern Conference team that should be traded, and I'll have another video out in a few days on a player from every team in the West that should be traded, so be on the lookout for that. As always, if you're new to the channel and you like this type of content, it would mean a great deal to me if you subscribe to help the channel grow, and in return I'll be providing more NBA content like this. Now, part of the reason I am breaking this video up by conferences is because I recently did a video on one player from every team in which this upcoming season is going to be the most important for that player. And going over a player from 30 teams ended up making for a very long video, but also making it very brief on the analysis of each player. So while this video will likely still be long, I'll be able to go a little more in depth on each of these players rather than glossing it over. Now, for some of these, it's going to be a little more obvious on who should be traded, and in those cases I'll probably go through them rather quickly, but I'll do my best to explain the rationale. Now, a few callouts: while there are some players on a given team that should be traded, for the purposes of this video we're going to also factor in a player that can realistically be traded based on their value and the overall fit with the team that they currently play for. So for example, it would be easy to say for the Brooklyn Nets that a player they should trade is Ben Simmons. Practically speaking though, no one is going to be taking Ben Simmons and his contract in a trade. So just want to throw that out there as we start going through these. But let's go ahead and get started with the Toronto Raptors, a team that is likely going to be going through a lot of changes as the season wears on. I expect them to be big time sellers at the deadline as they further try and reboot and rebuild this roster. And while I think the common answer is OG Anunoby because he's been in trade rumors for a while now, he can get a lot for you in return based on the fact that he's young, in his prime, has 2 years left on his deal with a player option on the last one. So there is a world where he declines his option and then leaves in free agency for nothing. But if I had to choose one player the Raptors should trade the most, it's Pascal Siakam. I mean, if the Raptors are looking to rebuild, Siakam at his age isn't going to fit their long-term plan. He's on an expiring deal, and you'd have to think he isn't going to be looking to re-up in Toronto if they fail to make the playoffs again. And for Siakam, he's still one of the better players in the league. Was an all-star last season, was third-team All-NBA the year before that. He can get you a ton of value in a trade, even despite the fact that he's on an expiring deal when a contending team can bring him in and then sign him to a longer-term extension. Value in the form of draft picks or young players, which is what the Raptors are going to need if they are going to be going the rebuilding route. Let's do the Knicks next. I mean, really, it should be Evan Fournier, who they never play and is still on a sizable contract that they for some reason gave to him. But I'm going to go with a more controversial answer here and say Julius Randle. Randle, as good as he's been, had a great season last year. He's just so up and down, and his attitude, his effort is kind of all over the place. I don't think he's fully invested in the team. He still has 3 years left on his deal, still in his prime, and while his trade value probably isn't as high as maybe it was in the regular season last year based on how he finished in the postseason, it's still enough to get you a considerable return for a Knicks team that just won their first playoff series in over a decade last year. Next, let's do the Nets. Like I said, not going to go with Ben Simmons, even though I think most Nets fans would like to see him traded. For the Nets, you're probably going to want to trade Spencer Dinwiddie. Expiring contract, he's 30 years old, a solid player, but for the Nets, who just traded away Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and looking to regroup and figure out a direction going forward, building with guys like Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, Nick Claxton, they have a ton of picks coming through to them from the Kevin Durant trade, but also lost a lot of those picks to bring in James Harden. So moving Dinwiddie, who likely isn't going to be a part of your long-term plan, will likely leave in free agency next summer, would be best to trade him and get some value off an expiring contract for a team that is in need of a veteran point guard and move forward with the new young core that you have. On the Boston Celtics, just traded their heart and soul of the team in Marcus Smart. Risky move if you ask me when it comes to shaking up the roster in a meaningful way when you're already a contending team. But for the Celtics, the player that should be traded the most, probably a boring one, but Malcolm Brogdon. Al Horford is up there as well, but I don't think you're going to be able to move Horford at his age when he still has 2 years left on his deal, where he's going to be making over $10 million per year. But Brogdon, while I think he fits perfectly in the system coming off the bench for the Celtics, the biggest challenge with him is that he just hasn't been able to stay healthy, and that's really throughout his career. Availability is the greatest ability, and when you have a player like Brogdon who still has 2 years left on his contract making over $22 million, it's going to be hard to move him. which they did in fact try to move him in that Clippers deal that fell through in the initial Kristaps Porzingis trade package. And why did it fall through? Concerns around Brogdon's health based on his last physical. So while the value you're going to get for Brogdon is going to be low, might not be as practical to move him, but really when you look across the rest of the roster in Boston, this is the player they should be trading more than anyone else. Let's do the Sixers now. I mean, this one is pretty easy. The guy who's demanding a trade and calling their president a liar, and how he's planning on holding out and not reporting to camp. Yeah, you might want to get a guy who is creating this level of toxicity off the team, even if it means you're going to have to give him up for much less than his overall value. And yes, of course, I'm talking about James Harden. Let's do the Indiana Pacers. This one is tough because the Pacers are kind of in this weird place where they're still rebuilding, but also looking to compete. Like, I wouldn't say this is a team that is going to be looking to tank this year. They signed Bruce Brown to a hefty contract after his run with the Nuggets in the playoffs last year. They've got older, in quotes, older guys like Buddy Hield, Miles Turner, Tice, TJ McConnell, but then they also have all these young guys, up-and-coming superstar Tyrese Halliburton, Benedict Mathurin going into his second season. And while Miles Turner has been in trade rumors for, seems like 3 years now, I actually think it's going to make more sense for the Pacers to trade Buddy Hield. Hield was actually the guy I said had the most riding on him this upcoming season for the Pacers, but given he's on an expiring contract, he's 30, which is one of the oldest players on that team, and because Hield has a skill that is highly coveted in the league, especially for contenders looking for players to help space the floor, his shooting from deep is some of the best in the NBA, shooting over 42% on over 8 attempts per game. That is just phenomenal, and it would be best served for the Pacers, who are likely thinking about how to build around Halliburton for the long run, to move Hield by the deadline before he becomes a free agent and gets to go to a destination of his choice with nothing in return for the Pacers. Let's do the Cleveland Cavaliers now. Another tough one given their push to win with all of the recent moves that they've made. For me, it's kind of a toss-up between Caris LeVert and Isaac Okoro. I'm going to say LeVert because Okoro is still young, still has some room to grow as a player. But I do also think there is some doubt there about if they want to commit to him long term, and if he's going to be a restricted free agent next summer. If they don't reach an extension before the start of this season, maybe they would look to move on from him. And while I actually think LeVert fits nicely with the Cavs when you compare him to the rest of the roster and what the team is trying to build, he's kind of the odd man out. But he's still a good enough player that can get you some value with 2 years left on his contract, and a player that is currently in his prime. Next, let's do my Chicago Bulls. Always hard to admit this one, and while I don't 100% think it would be the best move, as there are a lot of downsides to trading him, but if I had to pick one player the Bulls should trade over anyone else, it's DeMar DeRozan. Love DeMar, he's an incredible player. Already in just his first 2 seasons with the team, he's been an all-star both years, was second-team All-NBA the first season, and his veteran mentorship to some of the younger players is very valuable. But at the same time, when you compare it to the rest of the Bulls' trade assets, which aside from Zach LaVine is not very high, DeRozan, who is going to be in the final year of his contract, he's now 34 years old, and the Bulls, who missed the playoffs last year, need to start thinking about their future. And you'd have to think at DeMar's age, he's probably not in that future. So rather than letting him walk for nothing in free agency, get a package for him in return from a contending team that is needing another scoring option and a veteran presence. Let's do the Detroit Pistons. This one is pretty easy to me. The guy they need to be trading is Bojan Bogdanovic, 34-year-old Bogdanovic with a bunch of young guys who are developing and building this team. Bogdanovic still remains a great shooter, even in his mid-30s. At times last season, he was the Pistons' best player, with Cade being out most of the year. A contending team that is going to be a little desperate to get them over the top will look for an outside sharpshooter and might be willing to ship a protected first-round pick over to the Pistons. Next, let's do the Milwaukee Bucks. As I've said before, the Bucks know they're on the hot seat right now as it relates to keeping Giannis happy and getting him to sign an extension. Gotta show they mean business and are still contending with Giannis in the lineup. But to be honest, really the only player I can see as a potential that they should trade is Pat Connaughton. The main core of Giannis, Holiday, Middleton, Brook Lopez, you can't trade those guys. When this was the team that got you a championship not that long ago, and their contracts are fairly high, so it's not going to be that easy to move on from them at their ages. But Connaughton, again, you're not going to get good value for him, but this is really more so to free up cap space when Connaughton has 3 years left on his deal with a player option on the final year of that deal, making over $10 million. And Connaughton regressed quite a bit last year as it relates to his shooting and overall impact on the court, so much so that he was barely getting minutes by the end of the season. But again, if you compare it to the rest of the roster, this is the guy they should be looking to trade the most. Let's do the Charlotte Hornets, another team that is, I guess you could say, rebuilding. I mean, they were one of the worst teams in the league last last year, had injury problems, particularly with their best player in LaMelo Ball, got the number 2 pick in the draft, which they used to select Brandon Miller. I personally think it was a mistake to take him over Scoot Henderson, but time will tell on that one. But as far as a player they should trade, probably Gordon Hayward. You're going to have to trade him for pennies on the dollar, but he's in the final year of his contract. You'd have to think there is no way they re-sign him at his age and with his injury history. Trade him for something before you just let him walk for nothing. And while I'm sure some will say, well, how is this different from, say, trading Ben Simmons? Well, Hayward has still been more healthy than Ben Simmons and is serviceable when he's on the court, and he doesn't have multiple seasons left on his deal like Ben Simmons does. So a more practical trade than moving on from Ben Simmons. How about the Orlando Magic? This one is a little more straightforward to me. It's got to be Cole Anthony. I mean, solid player, but he doesn't really fit the needs of the roster, with the Magic really being covered in the backcourt between Fultz, Anthony Black, Gary Harris, Jalen Suggs. And the thing is, Cole Anthony is good enough of a player that will require a decently sized contract, where the Magic are likely not going to be willing to give him when his rookie deal expires at the end of the season, for a team that has to start setting cap space aside for big paydays for guys like Franz Wagner and Paolo Banchero. And again, like a lot of those guys I've mentioned, trade him now before you let him go in free agency next summer. For the Miami Heat, I mean, I'm only saying Tyler Hero because I do think he'll ultimately get moved in a deal to bring in Damian Lillard. Whether that's someone they should trade is maybe a different question, but Hero makes the most sense for now if it can net you Lillard and getting value for him while he's still young and about to enter his prime. How about the Washington Wizards, a team that has finally picked a direction, well, somewhat picked a direction in not just constantly being in basketball purgatory in the middle of the East, but building draft capital, taking in some young players. But as far as the player they should trade, and this is going to sound kind of odd because they just signed him to a big extension, but that's Kyle Kuzma. Now, before you go nuts on me in the comments, hear me out. Kuzma, along with Jordan Poole, makes the Wizards a little too good. I mean that, they're still going to be bad, but too good to really earn themselves a top pick in the draft. And with the Wizards accumulating a ton of picks between trading away Bradley Beal, Porzingis, and even a first-round pick and moving Chris Paul to get Jordan Poole, this team really should fully embrace the rebuild. And even though I think they can't trade Kuzma until January because they just extended him, moving him, a player that has the highest trade value on your team, and also shedding all of that salary for the future while obtaining some additional draft capital or young players, I just think makes the most sense for this team given the rest of the makeup of the roster, and to finally embrace the tank. And then finally, the last team, Atlanta Hawks, as far as who they should trade, pretty easy in my opinion. He's also been in trade rumors recently. Clint Capella still has value as a defensive big man, but with 2 years left on his deal at over $20 million, and with Onyeka Okongwu showing a lot of improvement over the past season, I think it's time to focus on prioritizing his development for the future and try and obtain some assets by moving on from Capella. But anyway, a little fast going through some of those, I know. Like I said, I'll have my Western Conference players that should be moved from each team in an upcoming video. Let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with some of the players I mentioned in this video. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.